Alright, so today's daf is chet. So we're going to start on daf zayin amud bet, bottom of the page, with the words gufa, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom. Gufa, amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, Na'atz kana b'rshut ha'yachid. If a person puts a kaneh b'rshut ha'yachid, he puts a pole in the private domain, v'sarak v'nachal gabav, and he throws from the public domain and it lands on this pole, afilu gavoa me'ama chayav. Even if the pole is 100 amotai, it's still considered to be to have landed in the Reshut HaYachid, in the private domain. Because the Reshut HaYachid, the private domain, goes up infinitely. In other words, if you are over the airspace of the Reshut HaYachid, you're in the Reshut HaYachid, you're in the private domain. It's as if it goes, there's no limit to its height. So, are we saying that Rav Chisda follows the position of Rabbi? It seems unusual that Rav Chisda would follow the minority opinion of Rabbi, who says that if you throw something and it lands on a ziz koshehu, which is a tiny protrusion, that one is chayav, which would seem to mean, according to how Rashi interprets it here, that he doesn't require that the object rest on a spot that is 4 by 4 tefachim. Remember that we said that in order to be considered resting, it has to rest on a spot that's 4 by 4 tefachim. And here he's saying that if it lands on a pole, which we assume is not 4 by 4 tefachim, because that would be a very, very large pole. So we're assuming we're talking about a smaller area than 4 by 4 tefachim, and yet he's saying that chayav.
Is that a different case
than
the previous case that they had brought in one of the previous Gemara of a basket that's planted on top of a pole and something that falls inside the basket?
No, yeah, this is a little bit different because the
basket is 4 by 4.
Right? Yeah, because the basket itself could be 4 by 4. Here we're talking about just on top of the pole. So they're comparing this to the case of the protrusion, the little twig or whatever that something lands on. That Rabbi says you're chayav because he says that even though it lands on a small twig, apparently he doesn't require 4 by 4 area, and Rav Chisda seems to be following that. So Amar Abaye, we move to Chet Amud Aleph. Abaye says B'Reshut HaYachid Kulei Alma Lo Pligei Kid Rav Chisda. Everybody agrees that in a Reshut HaYachid, Rav Chisda is right. And when something rests in a Reshut HaYachid, it doesn't require an area of 4 by 4 tefachim, because in a Reshut HaYachid, it's considered like a solid place. Anywhere that it is, it's considered to be stable in a Reshut HaYachid. However, Elahacha B'ilan Omid B'Reshut HaYachid V'Nafo Notel Reshut HaRabim. This is what we learned earlier, actually, a couple of dapim ago, that we're talking about a case where a tree is in the private domain and its branch is extending over to the public domain. Now, the branch area itself is not 4 by 4, but the body of the tree is very large, and it's landed, and it is in the Reshut HaYachid. So, the Rabbi Savar Amrinan Shadei Nofo Batar Ikaro, V'Rabbanan Savar Lo Amrinan Shadei Nofo Batar Ikaro. So, what the way that they interpret it, Rashi's second interpretation, which is the easier one of the two to apply to the Gemara, is that what it means is that Rav Chisda, everybody agrees in a private domain, you don't need an area of 4 by 4. When something lands in the private domain, it lands in the private domain, and that's the whole point of the pole. Not only can it be as high as you want, but it can be as whatever dimensions, because it's in the private domain. But what they were arguing was about a tree that's in the private domain because it's in an enclosed area, but there's a protrusion from the tree coming into the public area, and the protrusion itself is less than 4 by 4. So in that case, according to Rabbi, we say that even though that area itself is 4 by 4 tefachim, because it's less than 4 by 4 tefachim, since it's an extension from something that's in the private domain and is therefore considered 4 by 4 tefachim, we extend that even to the branches. That even though the specific point where this item is resting is not 4 by 4, the fact is that it's all that the body of the tree is located in the private domain, and the Chachamim say no. We look at exactly where the I have your Gemara here. Exactly where the object comes to rest. So since it comes to rest on a twig that's less than 4 by 4 tefachim, that's all we look at. We don't look at the fact that the branch is an extension of the body of the tree that's more than 4 by that is 4 by 4 tefachim. So that's the machloket between Rabbi and the Chachamim, and it has no relevance really to Rav Chisda, because because Rav Chisda is just is saying about a private domain that dimension doesn't matter. The question of whether an extension into the public domain is considered like it's base in the private domain or it's considered like a separate entity is a different machloket, a different argument. Yeah.
They consider then the branches of a tree compared to the trunk different than a hand compared to a body, because we already
even in the initial
right, because we already ruled on that in the previous
right. It's true. Apparently that's considered different.
So that's two different things.
Right. And okay, so that's basically we had actually seen this same point earlier, this idea of the protrusion from the private domain to the public domain, which can have two significances. It can have a significance in terms of, is the object that you threw considered to have landed in the public domain or the private domain? So for instance, if you were 1 amma away from this branch and you took something and you put it there, if it's considered, even though it's protruding from the private domain, so if it's considered actually in the private domain, you just transferred something from the public to the private domain. If it's in the public domain, you only transferred it 1 amma, so that's no problem. So that's another issue. So we have two issues. One issue is, does it get the status of being a 4x4 dimension plane, surface, and also does it get the status of being in the private domain, or do we look at it as being in the public domain because of its actual location physically? So that's the two issues there. So Amar Abaye Abaye says, Zarak kaveret l'reshut harabim gavoa yud ve'ena rechavai vav chayav. This is a very interesting case. If you throw a basket, and the basket is 10 tefachim in height. So you have to imagine a basket has height, and it's a circular, it's a wicker basket, let's say. So it's a circular, it looks like a garbage can shaped basket, one of the circular garbage cans or something, and you threw it into the Reshut Yachid. It's 10 tefachim tall, but but inside it's less, its width, okay? The width of the circular part is less than 6 tefachim inside. What's the significance of that? So Rashi says that a 6 tefach, if something has a diameter of 6 tefachim, you can square a 4x4 tefachim area out of it. So since normally you need a 4x4 tefachim area, 6 tefachim circular, in other words, a diameter of 6 tefachim is about. It's actually It's approximately. He mentions, Rashi mentions that really it's a little bit less than that. Even he says that even if it's 5 tefachim and 3/5, it would really be enough for you to make a square of 4x4 tefachim out of it. But he says he's not being, they're rounding off basically by saying 6 tefachim. So if you have a basket, so what's the issue here? So that if you have a basket that's 10 tefachim tall and has a diameter of 6 tefachim, so basically what you have is a Reshut HaYachid. Because the basket itself has the dimensions of a Reshut HaYachid, because it has 10 tefachim walls and it has 4x4 area inside. So you have a Reshut HaYachid. Okay, if it's less than 6 tefachim in diameter, so therefore it's less than 4x4 inside. So that's the first case. So then chayav, what you threw was just you threw a basket into the Reshut HaRabim. That's not good. But if rechava vav patur, if it has 6 tefachim in diameter, so therefore you basically threw a Reshut HaYachid into the Reshut HaRabim, that is patur. You're going to be exempt. Now Rashi and Tosafot have a big machloket over here, or since they're Ashkenazim, we could say they have a machlokes, a big one over here, about why are you patur? Why are you exempt if you throw this basket that constitutes a Reshut HaYachid into the Reshut HaRabim? Why? So Rashi says, because since we learn all halachot of the malachot, all of the laws of work on Shabbat, we learn them from the Mishkan. And in the Mishkan, what did they throw? They didn't throw rishuyot. They didn't throw domains. They threw objects from one domain to another. But throwing a domain doesn't constitute carrying. Okay, that's Rashi's opinion. Apparently nobody else interprets it. That's very creative. But nobody else agrees with that apparently. And so the Tosafot bring a different reason, that they say actually the reason is because when you throw a Reshut HaYachid from a Reshut HaYachid into a Reshut HaRabim, when it lands, it's as if you just threw it into a Reshut HaYachid through the Reshut HaRabim, but basically you threw it into a Reshut HaYachid because we look at the basket as being its own domain. So all you did was, in other words, it was in a Reshut HaYachid, and when it lands, it is a Reshut HaYachid. So nothing's actually changed. We don't look at it as being in the Reshut HaRabim, basically, according to Tosafot, because when it lands, it creates its own domain. So it's not. So basically, it's a nuance here. But basically, what the difference is that Rashi would say, yeah, you moved something from the private to the public domain, but what you moved is not an item that's subject to the laws of carrying, because it is a domain. According to Tosafot, you didn't even move anything from the private domain to the public domain, because when you moved it from the private domain and put it in the public domain, it still was a private domain itself. So it's not even looked at as being in the public domain. We don't see a house and say, oh, the house is in a Reshut Rabim. We don't look at the house as being in the Reshut Rabim. We look at the house as a Reshut Yachid, as a private domain. So that's the way Tosafot is looking at it. That since it is a domain, we don't look at it as being located in a public domain. We just look at it as a private domain. All private domains are surrounded by public domains, of course, by definition. Okay, more or less. So then Rava says, Rava Amar Afilu Eina Rechava Patur, that even if, according to Rava, even if it's less than a diameter of 6 tefachim, you're still exempt. Why? Because if this is a 10 tefachim wicker basket, it's impossible that some threads, or whatever you call it, of the wicker don't extend higher than 10 tefachim by a tiny amount. So you threw this basket in to the Reshut Rabim, it landed in a normal way. It landed normally. Okay, and the top, so it's 10 tefachim, but the edge of that wicker on the top, because we know that it's, a little bit, let's say, it has rough edges, so it has protrusions on the top. A little bit of it is going to be a tiny bit above 10 tefachim, because it's going to protrude. He says, therefore, the entire item doesn't rest in the Reshut Rabim, because remember, a Reshut Rabim only extends up to 10 tefachim, and if the entire object doesn't rest within the Reshut Rabim, it's not considered to have rested in the Reshut Rabim. So he's being even more lenient. If it's 10 tefachim, anything that's 10 tefachim tall, Rava is saying, if it's made of a material like wicker, where the item is going to protrude above the 10 tefachim, it's not going to be considered completely resting in the Reshut Rabim. So that's even more lenient than what Abaye said. Now we go to another case, Kaf al Piha. So what happens if instead of throwing the basket into the Reshut Rabim and it lands in the normal way on its bottom, you turned it upside down and it lands on its front? Okay, so imagine a lampshade, basically. It lands in a lampshade form. Instead of landing upwards, like in a wastebasket form, it lands downward. So what's the halacha there? Very interesting. So Shiva umashehu, if it's 7, now forget about the 10 now. If it's 7 tfachim in height, so there chayav shiva u'mechetza patur. But if it's more than 7, it says 7.5. But Rashi says even if it is 7 1/4, it doesn't matter. Even if it's 7 and a little bit more, it's going to be patur. Why? So here we have to know a principle called gud achit, which means that the walls go downwards. So once something comes within 3 tefachim of the ground, it's considered to have landed. That's why even the walls of a sukkah, they only have to come down within 3 tefachim of the ground. So if it comes down within 3 tefachim of the ground, it's considered to have landed. So if it's 7 tefachim in height, then when it comes within 3 tefachim, the entirety of the basket is within the 10 tefachim of the Reshut Rabim. Why? Because even if it's 3 tefachim, it came into within 3 tefachim. Let's say it came to 2 tefachim, and at that point, the 7 tefachim, so it came into 2 and 3/4 tefachim, within 2 3/4 tefachim of the ground. So the entire thing was actually within 10 tefachim of the ground, because it's 7 tefachim and it came into the 3 tefachim, within 3 tefachim of the ground. So the entire thing is within 10 tefachim of the ground. But if the basket is 7.5 tefachim, then when it enters within 3 tefachim of the ground, there's still part of it that's above 10 tefachim from the ground. You have to imagine it, okay? Let's say this, it's hard to do with only 2 hands, but let's say this is within 3 tefachim of the ground. And here's the basket. It's coming down. It came within 3 tefachim of the ground. Where's the top of the basket? Over 10 tefachim from the ground. So when it is defined as having landed, which is at this point, its top is more than 10 tefachim from the ground. If it's exactly 7 tefachim, let's say, so when it comes within 3 tefachim of the ground, the entire thing is within the 10 tefachim. But if it's more than that, then when its bottom reaches within 3 tefachim of the ground, its top is going to be above 10 tefachim from the ground. So that means when it's effectively landed, it's landed with its top outside of the Reshut HaRabim. That's what Abaye is saying here. Okay, my Tama, what's the reason? I'm sorry, I skipped a part. So what happens? So Rav Ashi Amar afilu shiva umechetza chayav. Rav Ashi disagrees with this idea of Abaye. He says no, that even if it's 7.5, I disagree. Why? Because because these walls. When do we say good achit? When do we say that walls protrude downwards? When they're walls that are actually made to create an enclosure. But here, these walls are not made to create an enclosure. These walls are just made for using a basket when it's turned the other way. Okay? So when you have walls that are made to create an enclosure, you can say, okay, if they're within 3 tefachim of the ground, then effectively we're going to say that they extend down to the bottom. We're not going to be picky about the 3 tefachim. But when you're dealing with the basket is not made for its walls to protrude down to create an enclosure. The basket is made for it to be held upwards and to be used as a basket for the inside of the basket. So therefore, we're not going to apply this rule that the walls of the basket extend down and create a reshut of its, or create it's as if they protrude downward, and therefore this thing is considered to be more than 10 tefachim from the ground of the Reshut HaRabim, because we're not going to extend its walls down at all. And actually, in fact, here Rashi and Tosafot have another machloket, which is Rashi says that this case of Abaye is talking about a basket that's less than 6 tefachim in diameter, in which case it's not a reshut. It's not a domain of its own. According to Tosafot, this is continuing on the same case as before, and it is a domain of its own, and that's why this idea of maybe the walls protruding down, or extending downward, is being discussed. But either way, Rav Ashi disposes of it and says, you know what? We don't apply that to the walls of a basket. Real walls, yes, but walls of a basket are not made to create an enclosure. We're not going to be creative and imagine them extending downward and holding the basket up in midair, so to speak. So now we move on. Amar Ula says, Amud tish'a b'reshut harabim v'rabim mechatefin alav v'zarag v'nachal gabav chayav. So if there is an amud, a pillar, which is 9 tefachim tall, in the public domain, and people generally rest their bag on it, or they lean on it, they use it for various things. So chayav, somebody who throws an object and it lands on that pillar, it's as if it landed in the Reshut HaRabim itself. My tama, what's the reason? Pachot mishlosha midras darsei larabim. Because anything within 3 tefachim of the ground, people will walk over. Mishlosha v'yad tisha lo midras darsei la le v'lo katufei mekatvet. But from 3 to 9 tefachim is basically a limbo, because nobody's going to step on something that's more than 3 tefachim in the public domain. It's too tall, and nobody's going to use it to rest their bag on because it's too short. So it's kind of like Goldilocks type of situation. It doesn't fit. It's either too hot or too cold. It doesn't fit either one. So what happens? Tishav v'adai mechatfini lave. But when it's 9 tefachim, it's exactly the right height for people to use it. So since it's easy for people in the public domain to use, and we learned yesterday that something is nicha tashmishte, if something is readily usable and easily accessible to people in the public domain, it's considered part of the public domain. Something that's within 3 tefachim of the ground, since people walk over it, it's considered part of the public domain. Something that's 9 tefachim tall, something that's 10 tefachim tall, obviously it's already outside of the public domain, the top of it. That's what we learned about before, but it's outside of it because it's 10 tefachim tall. And if it's 4 by 4 tefachim, it's going to be a reshut hayachid. But something that is 9 tefachim, that's Ula is saying is part of the public domain. So Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef guma mai. So Abaye said to Rav Yosef, what about a pit in the public domain? Do you apply the same? That a 9 tefach deep pit in the Reshut HaRabim is considered part of the Reshut HaRabim because maybe somebody's going to store articles in there. A 10 tefachim deep, it can't be, because that will already be like a Reshut HaYachid practically, especially if it's got wider dimensions. But if it's 9 tefachim, maybe people will put stuff in there in the Reshut HaRabim. So Amar le v'chen beguma. So Rav Yosef said, you're right. Even a pit in the Reshut HaRabim, if it's 9 tefachim deep, we're going to apply the same rule that Ula said. We're going to say it's part of the public domain. Now here,
fit to the prior.
Right now here, right.
The sota, where you would be, secluded.
Right. No, but that's only in Tum'ah. This is talking about Shabbat. In Shabbat, seclusion is not an issue.
But they contrasted it to find out what is Reshut Rabim versus...
True, but that was right. But here we're talking about Shabbat. So the only issue in Shabbat is the use of the public use.
So,
now the one distinction here that some of the Mefarshim point out is that obviously in the case of a guma, in the case of a pit, it's the opposite of Ulah's case, because in Ulah's case, if it's from 3 to 9 tefachim, it's not useful. 9 tefachim, it's useful because it's right at the height that you want to rest your bag on it. Okay? With a pit, it's the opposite. The more shallow the pit, the more likely somebody is to use it. The deeper the pit, the less. So one would think that, hey, anything from 1 to 9 tefachim should be usable in the pit, not 9 tefachim being special, because that's a little bit that's already deep. Yeah. That's true. It's a pothole. Rava says, Beguma lo. Rava says, no, you're wrong, Rav Yosef. I disagree. A guma, a pit, is not like an amud. It's not like a pillar. Why? Because difficult use is not called use. In the public domain, what do we define as part of the public domain? That which is readily accessible. A pillar sitting there, we see it all the time. You walk in the city, you walk in D.C., you walk in New York City. If there's something that's around shoulder, around mid body height, people will lean on it, people will put something down on it. People will sit on it. But something that is a pit in the ground, nobody's going to use that. So it's not easy to use. So it's not considered part of the public domain. Rav Ada bar Matana raised an objection. He said, הייתה קופתו מונחת ברשות הרבים גבוה 10 ורחבה ד' אין מטלטלין לו מתוכה לרשות הרבים ולא מרשות הרבים מתוכה פחות מכן מטלטלין וכן בגומה. That there was a case that if you have a basket in the Reshut HaRabim, if the basket is, like we said before, it's 10 tefachim tall, and it has dimensions of 4 by, let's say a square basket now, 4 by 4 tefachim inside, so what is that? It's a Reshut HaYachid. It has the dimensions of a private domain, because it has 10 tefachim in height, and it has 4 by 4 tefachim in its width and length. So that's a Reshut HaYachid. So if it's in the public domain, you can't take anything out of it to the public domain, and you can't take anything from the public domain and put it in that basket. The basket itself is a private domain. This is a problem. However, if it's less than those dimensions, you can. Okay, if it's less than those dimensions, it's okay. V'chen beguma. And so too with a guma. So too with a pit in the public domain. That if it's less than the dimensions of 10 tefachim deep and 4 by 4 tefachim in length and width, one should be able to move things in and out of it to the public domain. So that means it's part of the public domain. Because what Rava is actually saying is that a 9 tefach deep pit should be a karmelit. It should be an area which is prohibited to move from objects from it back and forth to the public domain. If it's part of the public domain, you could transfer something from in it to the public domain as long as it's not for amot. But if it's a karmelit, you can't. So he's saying it's like a karmelit. It's one of these rabbinically prohibited areas. A karmelit is like a place that basically is an area that isn't for, like your front yard of a house. Is a karmelit because it's not walled, but it's not for the public use. And somebody would have to come off the road and go in your front yard, which they wouldn't normally do. So it's like that. That it's not Reshut HaYachid. Biblically, on the Torah level, it's actually nothing. It's neutral. It's not public and it's not private. But the rabbis basically treated it with stringency and said you can't use it because it's similar to a private domain and it's similar to a public domain, so we can't use it for either. That's basically how they worked it. I'm just giving an example. Any area that is not walled, it's not enclosed, but it's not public. Well, if you have a fence in the back of your house.
Define public for him.
Public use. So, like if it's a place that people go in and out. So it could be a back of your house if it's open, then it would be a karmelit. If the back of your house is fenced, then it's a private domain because it's fenced. But I think a good example of an area, or like a cul-de-sac, let's say, or a dead end street, could be a karmelit because it's not a thoroughfare. It's a closed area, but it doesn't have a fence.
Yeah. Hallway in an apartment building.
That's more common. That's called a chatzer.
It's walled.
That's called a chatzer. That comes later.
Okay.
So a hallway in an apartment building is a shared. It's
right.
Biblically a private domain actually, but because it's shared rabbinically, it's called a chatzer. So there's certain things that have to be done. Eruv chatzerot. Yeah. We're going to learn more about that later. Yeah. So anyway, it would seem from this statement that a pit in the ground that's 9 tefachim should be considered part of the public domain, because he said that if it's v'chen beguma, so too with a pit that you can move objects from it to the public domain if it's only 9 tefachim. So he says lav asefa, and isn't it my lav asefa? Doesn't it mean that that's the case, and therefore that contradicts Rava? Says no, lo aresha. It's only talking about the beginning. In other words, what Rava will say is that what did it mean v'chen beguma? So too with a pit. It meant that if there's a hole in the ground that's 10 tefachim deep and 4 by 4 in its length and width, that's a private domain, and you can't take from it to the public domain. But we're not saying that if it's only 9 tefachim that you can. We're just saying that if it's 10 tefachim, it's going to be biblically prohibited. It's going to be a reshut yachid. So Etive, they raised another objection as we move to Amud Bet. Nitkaven l'shbot b'reshut harabim v'iniach eruvo babor lemala miyud tefachim eruvo eruv lemata miyud tefachim en eruvo eruv. So what is this saying? Basically, the halacha is that if a person is in the middle of nowhere, they have only 2,000 amot that they can travel. This is called the prohibition of tichumin. Tichumin means that in an unpopulated area, you can leave whatever populated area. Let's say you're in a city or a town. You can exit the populated area, the city limits, let's say, for 2,000 amot, but that's it. Now let's say the next town over is 4,000 amot away. It's not 2,000, it's 4,000. And you want to go there because there's something going on. So you can make an eruv tichumin. What that means is you go into the forest between the two towns, I'm just saying for instance, and you put what's called the eruv tichumin, which is some food at this spot. And it has to be there at the beginning of Shabbat. And you say, I'm making my Shabbat in this place. That's what eruv tichumin is. Now it gives you another 2,000 amot that you can go. Okay, that's how eruv tichumin works. So, but the eruv tichumin has to be accessible to you on Shabbat. So that's why he says, if you put an eruv in a pit, so you went to the forest to put your eruv tichumin so you could extend the amount of time, the amount of distance you could walk, and you put it in a little pit because you didn't want anybody to find it, obviously, and come take it. So, or a bear's or whatever, whoever else will take it. So you put it in a pit. If the pit is, it says lemala miyud, if it's above 10 tefachim, meaning it's within 10 tefachim from the ground, so that's okay because you could actually take it. But if it's lemata miyud, if it's below 10 tefachim in the ground, you can't take it out on Shabbat because you can't take from the private domain. That now that pit is going to be a private domain. You can't take from there to the public domain, so it's not going to count as an eruv. So what does it mean here? It can't mean that we're talking about a pit that is 10 tefachim deep and that it matters where in the pit you place the food. That would make a difference because mali lemala mali mata. Because if you have once you have a private domain, it doesn't matter how close you are to the object, it's in a private domain. So it might be that it's an inch away from you, but it's in a pit that's a private domain. So you can't bring it into the public domain. So what word are we talking about? We're talking about a pit that itself doesn't have 10 tefachim. V'katane eruvo eruv. So what do you see? You see from here that because this pit is less than 10 tefachim deep, it's only 9 tefachim deep, and you put the eruv in there, that it's still considered to be in the public domain. Because it's even though it's tashmish al yidei adechak, even though it's what's considered inconvenient usage, because it's underneath the ground, as opposed to the pillar that Ula was talking about, which is above the ground and is easy to use. So it's an inconvenient usage because you have to go down to get it, but still it's considered to be an extension of the public domain because it's within 9 tefachim of the public domain and is therefore looked at as something accessible to the public use and part of the public domain.
Did the Gemara at this point accept the fact that a 4x4 pit is a private domain?
A 4x4 pit, if it's 10 tefachim, is for sure, yeah, that's for sure. Now, So what do you see though? You see that this is telling you that you're in the same place as this item that's in a 9 tefach deep pit, which means it's part of the public domain, which means that a 9 tefach deep pit is part of the public domain, even though usage of it is inconvenient. That's against what Rava said, because Rava said that true for an amud, for a pillar, I'll accept that. But a pit, how could you say a pit is convenient? It's not part of the public usage, and therefore it's not going to be part of the public domain. So so it says zimnin mishanele. So just like we had before, he had two different answers for this, and depending on how he was feeling that day, he gave a different answer. Okay, sometimes he would say hu ve'eruvo bekarmelit, that actually the area and the pit are in a karmelit. So it's like it's an area that's not a thoroughfare, such as perhaps a forest, which is not enclosed, but not a place that people would pass through normally. So it's a karmelit. It's considered to be this sort of limbo area, not a public domain and not a private domain. And that's why even though it's in a pit that's 9 tefachim deep, that's also a karmelit. So it's just moving from one part of the karmelit to another part. Because both the area that he's in and the pit are a karmelit. Neither one is really a reshut harabim. V'amai karei la reshut harabim. So why then did it say in this statement that somebody who wanted to rest, who wanted to make their techum in the public domain? Because lafisha ina reshut hayachid, like we saw before, sometimes the term reshut harabim is just used for something that's not a private domain. So what really the whole thing is a karmelit, and it's not saying that a pit of 9 tefachim is looked at as part of the public domain. It isn't, because it would be inconvenient. But both the place where he's standing and the pit are a karmelit, meaning they're not a public domain, but they're not a private domain. V'zimnid mishanelei, and sometimes he would answer like this: hu b'reshut harabim ve'eruvo bekarmelit. True, he is in the reshut harabim, just like it says. He's in the public domain, and it's also true that this 9 tefach deep pit is not part of the public domain. It's actually a karmelit also. But however, v'rabihi, but this is following the opinion of Rabbi. Da'amar kol davar shehu mishum shavot lo gazeru alav ben hashemashot. That anything which is because of shavot. Shavot means it means something which is a rabbinical prohibition of Shabbat. A rabbinical prohibition of Shabbat doesn't apply during Ben HaShemashot. It doesn't apply during twilight. So from sunset to Tzet Kochavim, to when the stars come out, it doesn't apply. And therefore, even though it's true that he put this eruv in a place where on Shabbat itself he wouldn't be able to take it out, because on Shabbat itself it's in a pit which is a 9 tefach deep pit, and it's a karmelit, and you can't transfer rabbinically, you can't transfer from a karmelit to a public domain on Shabbat. But from sunset to Tzet Kochavim, since it's only a rabbinical prohibition, it wouldn't apply. He would have access to the food that he put in the pit. And all that's important for Eruv Techumin is that at the moment Shabbat starts, you had access to it. So since during Ben HaShemashot at the beginning you would have had access to it, that's good enough for the Techum to take effect and to allow you to extend your distance of walking.
So wait, a karmelit inside a karmelit, that didn't resolve the problem?
That you could, no, he gave him two answers. He said either it's a karmelit within a karmelit, or it's a reshut harabim and the pit is a karmelit.
Right.
According to both answers, the pit is a karmelit.
So either
right?
way that works.
Yeah. So, yeah. The negative of saying that it's a reshut harabim, that is saying that he's in a karmelit and it's in a karmelit too, is that it says reshut harabim in the actual statement. It says he's in a reshut harabim. So this is easier.
Rabbi, is the space between two cities always a karmelit?
No, it depends. A thoroughfare or a public domain is a public domain. It doesn't have to be paved, but whatever is a public thoroughfare is always a public domain. A karmelit is a place that's in between the two. It's not private because it's not enclosed, and it's not public because it's not really either accessible to public use or meant for public use. Like a front yard is a good example, or an unfenced backyard is a good example, because it's a space that's not enclosed. Right, but it's not a public thoroughfare. Okay, so next, and don't say that I'm just making up an answer to push you off. Why? Because davka kamelach. Because I mean it davka. I really mean it. Titnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, that if there was a puddle of water in the Reshut Harabim, and it's muddy, dirty water, and you were to throw something for amot and it landed in the muddy, dirty water, it's considered to have landed in the Reshut Harabim because the people walk through it. It's part of the thoroughfare, so it's considered part of the public domain. If it were an area where people wouldn't walk through it, then it wouldn't be part of the public domain. It would be considered karmelit, like we said before. But since people walk through it, it's okay. Ve'kamahu rakak mayim. What's considered a puddle of water? Pachot miyud tfachim. As long as it's a sort of a ditch in the road that's less than 10 tfachim deep. But if it's 10 tfachim deep, it's already considered a reshut yachid. It's a separate thing. Okay, it's not going to be considered a part of the public domain anymore. So, okay. So, v'rakak ma'im shurshur z'rabi me'alechet bo, hazarik l'tochot dalet amot chayav, and it kind of repeats itself, the Mishnah. Then it says, a puddle that the people walk through, somebody who throws into it 4 amot is chayav. Okay? So it says it twice. Why does it mention this case twice? So we understand why it mentions the puddle twice. Because there's a difference between summertime and wintertime. Because we need both. Because you might have said that during the summertime people like to walk through puddles because it cools them off. So a puddle in the middle of the street is going to be considered part of the Reshut HaRabim because people like to walk through it. But maybe you would think during the winter time, when it's already cold, nobody wants to walk through there. It's not considered part of the public domain. You might argue the opposite. You might say that no, that actually in the wintertime people are already muddy and dirty anyway because the streets are all wet and dirty. So nobody cares. They just say, hey, what the heck? We'll walk through the puddle. But during the summertime, maybe they want to stay clean. So in either case, you might think that the puddle is not going to be considered part of the Reshut HaRabim because there's a reason why people might be more likely to walk through it in the summertime than the wintertime. And there's a reason why people might be more likely to walk through it in the wintertime than the summertime. But at the end of the day, in all cases, it's considered part of the Reshut HaRabim unless it's 10 tefachim deep, in which case it's considered separate, both because people will avoid stepping in it, and also possibly because it could even be a Reshut HaRabim if it actually has the dimensions. But definitely people will avoid stepping into it, it would seem. So what do you see? So we understand that. But why does it have to? We understand why it has to mention 2 cases of the puddle, because the puddle during the summertime and the puddle during the wintertime. Why does it have to mention the idea of the people walking through it twice? So it says because the reason why is to tell you that walking through an area, if the public uses an area as a thoroughfare, even if it's al yidei adachak, even though it's not the most comfortable way of walking through, but they walk through it normally on a regular basis, that's considered a thoroughfare still. Even though they don't, maybe it's not as pleasant, but they do it, that's fine. But tashmish al yidei adachak, the reason why it emphasizes that an area people walk through, even if it's not the most convenient because there's a big puddle in the middle, but they do it, it's still considered part of the public domain. But an area that people use, like a pit in the ground, if it's inconvenient, it's not considered part of the public domain. So the fact that it's emphasizing a place that people walk through, is to tell you that even though it's inconvenient, walking through it makes it a thoroughfare. But in anything else inconvenient, like a pit in the ground, is not considered part of the public domain. And that's what Ravak concludes. So therefore the pit that's 9 tefachim, since it's accessible, but it's not convenient, so it's not considered part of the public domain. And Shema Bina, that is the conclusion. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Hai zirzat dikaneh, Ramav zakve, lo mechayev, ad akarle. If you have like a bundle of sticks, so one way you could carry it, and the easiest way to show is by displaying it. Basically what it means is that you do this. You lift it up, and you put it down. You lift it up, and you put it down. Like a slinky walks, okay? So it never totally gets off, it's never lifted up off the ground. Just that one end is lifted up, and then you put it down. The other end is put down. That end then becomes the bottom, and it's standing up vertically, and then the other end is put down. So you transport it, but you never actually lift it because you straighten it up and you push it forward so that it's again flat on the ground. You lift it up again by the other side and you put it down again so that it's forward. So what ends up happening is that you transport it, but it's never elevated off of the ground. So it says in that case you wouldn't be chayav. You never violate the prohibition because you never lifted it. Because you never lifted it off the ground.
Stroller, you're not chayav?
Actually, it talks about dragging things. If it's something that's normally, that's a normal way of moving it, you would be. Yeah, you would be. So something that normally is dragged is still, that's considered carrying it.
You put square wheels.
Good luck. Good luck with that one. I don't think you'll have much of a market for that, but you could try. Okay, so that's the halakha there. So Amar Mar, the master said, Adam Amir al Iskopa notel mi balabayit v'noten lo, notel me ani v'noten lo. So we said that there's a place, like basically it sounds like a porch, okay, where a person could be standing in between the house and the public domain. And he can take from the poor person, and he can give to the poor person. And he can take from the Balabayit, and he can give to the Balabayit. And we said what the Balabayit is the person standing inside the house. The poor person is the person standing in the street. Okay? So in other words, it's an area that you can take back and forth from the public domain, and you can take back and forth from the private domain, but you shouldn't take something from the private domain and then transfer it to the person in the public domain. Or vice versa. Take from somebody in the public domain and transfer it to somebody in the private domain. However, if you did that, it's still patur. You didn't violate any prohibition because that area in the middle is not considered a significant area, as we're going to see. So, ma iskupat reshut harabim notel mi balabayit ha mapik mi reshut yachid reshut harabim vela iskupat reshut yachid notel min ani ha kamayel mi reshut harabim le reshut yachid. It can't be that this porch is a private domain, because then how could he be taking from the guy in the public domain? And it can't be that it's a public domain, because how could he be taking from the guy in the private domain? Okay, ela iskupat karmelit, but then you must say that it's a karmelit, the in between. But then notel v'noten lechatchila, so sof yisura mihaita. It can't be that either, because we know that rabbinically it's prohibited to take from a private domain to a karmelit or vice versa, and it's prohibited to take from a public domain into a karmelit or vice versa. So how could it say that? Ela iskupa makom pitur be'almahu. Rather, what is this porch? It's a makom pitur, which means it is neither a private domain, nor a karmelit, nor a reshut harabim. It's neither of the three, because it doesn't have the dimensions of 4x4. If it's not, so something that is would be a karmelit, because it's not walled, okay, and it's not public, and it's not private. So it would be a karmelit normally. It's not fully private because it's not walled, and it's not public. But it doesn't have the dimensions.
Wait, what doesn't have the dimension of?
And a makom patur. Makom patur means, in other words, what is the difference between karmelit and makom patur? Is that a makom patur, the iskuba, this porch. Right. So what?
Probably a parapet or something.
Okay, I was just trying.
Standing in the street.
Yeah, because it has
A threshold, whatever, the threshold, this threshold area.
Right, okay.
Let's say a threshold area.
It has no wall. It's like almost a gangplank.
Right. It's right in front of the house. Let's say there's like a little area right in front of the door. Okay. So it's not part of the Reshut Harabim, and it's not part of the Reshut HaYachid, and it's not a karmelit because it doesn't have 4x4 tefachim. It's a small area. Okay. The difference between a karmelit and makom patur is it doesn't have dimensions. So it's not really considered a makom in its own right. It doesn't have a status as a location really in its own right. So it's actually the only thing that halachically is completely nothing. So what are examples of makom patur? One is this area that would be a karmelit basically, because it's neither here nor there. It's neither reshut hayachid nor reshut harabim, but it's because it doesn't have dimensions of 4x4 tefachim in its area. It's not a karmelit. The other example of a makom patur is above 10 tefachim in the Reshut Harabim, or above 10 tefachim in the Karmelit. It's considered makom patur. It doesn't have any status at all. Okay? So that's what this area is. That's why you can take from the private domain into it. You can take from the public domain and put it in. Where?
Makom patur.
What does he say?
Makom she'ein bo arba al arba.
Right, en bo arba al arba. Right.
Makom mesuyam sheyesh lo rosh rachak tzad. So it's a specific small little place.
Right, so it's a small little place.
Ledge.
Right, it's a small little place that has its own defined area. It's its own defined area, but it's not significant enough to have its own identity, basically. That's what it is.
Very rare.
Maybe.
That's right.
It's not that common. It's not that common. Most things fall into one of the other categories, but it could exist. Okay, so kegon deled pe daled al daled, because it doesn't have 4x4 tefachim. V'chi had ki atar Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan makom shein bo daled al daled tefachim mutar levnei reshut yachid levnei reshut rabim lechatef alav. That as Rav Dimi said, bringing the teaching from Rabbi Yochanan in Israel, that any area that doesn't have 4x4 tefachim, it's okay for both members of the reshut yachid and reshut rabim to put their bags on it. So if you have this little makom misuyam, as Rashi says, it has to be a defined area that is neither meets. Like, so for instance, an example of this would be, let's say something which is 4 tefachim high in the Reshut HaRabim, or 5 tefachim high in the Reshut HaRabim. So it's not part of the Reshut HaRabim. And it's not a karmelit, because it doesn't have 4x4 tefachim in its dimensions. And it's not a Reshut HaYachid, because it's not 10 tefachim tall. Either, right? So, it doesn't have 4 by 4 tefachim, so it couldn't be a Reshut Yachid, right? So it's not 9 tefachim tall, because then that would be considered part of the Reshut Rabim, like we learned before. So it has to be somewhere lower than that. Let's say 5 tefachim, and it's only 3 by 3 tefachim in its width and length. Okay, so somebody can put their items on it. It's no problem. Let's say I'm in my house, and it's right in front of my house, and the Reshut Rabim. So I could put something on it, and so could the person from the Reshut Rabim, because it's an item which is neither a karmelit, because it doesn't have 4 by 4 tefachim, nor part of the Reshut Rabim, nor part of the Reshut Yachid. It's nothing.
Pitching square,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a soapbox.
A soapbox, yeah.
We get up this little.
The soapbox, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, a little ledge, yeah. That's it. Yeah, it's like that. So bilvad shelo yachlifu, as long as they don't transfer. In other words, you shouldn't do a trick, and basically the guy in the Reshut Rabim puts something on the Makom Patur, and then a guy in the Reshut Yachid takes it, because then you're like it's dangerous, because then you're basically transferring from the public to the private domain through a subterfuge, and we're concerned that you'll end up doing it directly. So we don't want you to do that. So Amar Mar, the master said, ubelvad shelo yitom libalabayit v'noten le'ani me'ani v'noten lebalabayit. Same idea, that you shouldn't take from the poor person, give it to the and give it to the balabait, or take from the balabait and give it to the poor person. That's called that's right. That's called redistribution of wealth. You take from the wealthy and you give to the poor person. You shouldn't do that. If they did that, they're patur, because they didn't do a malacha. So, and this is the last point. This seems like a contradiction to Rava. As we go to the top of Tet, that if a person took something from the Reshut Rabim, in the Reshut Rabim rather, and he transferred it 4 amot, okay, which is one of the prohibitions, even though he did it derech alav, which Rashi says is he did it on his shoulder, okay, so when he carried it, it was above 10 tefachim in the public domain. So it was in a Makom Patur. Makom Patur it was in. It wasn't in the Reshut Rabim. And then he sets it down. Chayav. He's still Chayav. So what did Rava say? Even if I pick something up in the public domain and I put it down in the public domain, it doesn't matter that it traveled through the Makom Patur. I'm still Chayav. So what's the difference here? It's saying that I can't, that if the poor person in the Reshut Rabim gives something to the person in the Makom Patur, and the person in the Makom Patur transfers it to the person inside the house, that no malacha was done. But why not? Rava says that the fact that it passed through a Makom Patur doesn't exempt you. So the difference is hatam lo nach hachanach. The difference is because in Rava's case it's one action. In other words, you picked something up in the Reshut Rabim and you carried it like this, too high. But then when it comes down, it comes down. But in the case of our case with the Makom Patur, so the transfer occurred and it stopped in the Makom Patur, because I gave something to the guy in the Makom Patur. He took it. It rested. Then it went from the Makom Patur to the Reshut Yachid. So it made its way from the public to the private domain, but it actually stopped in the middle. In Rava's case, it never stopped in the middle. It traveled through the Makom Patur, but it never rested in the Makom Patur.
Why is this even discussed? Didn't we? I mean, if the end result is going to be that you're going to be Patur,